For a decade, I've been employed as a truck driver for various companies. 3 years back, I was employed by a warehouse firm tasked with making deliveries. My vehicle of choice was a semi-trailer truck, and it was precisely the one I was operating on April 10th. It was a bone-chilling Monday, marking the beginning of a new work week, and an abundance of cargo awaited delivery. My aim was to expedite the deliveries as swiftly as possible. I commenced my drive at 3 o'clock in the afternoon with the intention of reaching my destination that same evening. I was determined to avoid any overnight stopovers. To expedite my journey, I began to exceed the speed limit by a considerable margin, quite a feat for a semi-trailer truck. As time passed, fatigue began to set in, but with just an hour remaining until my destination, I was determined to power through without a break. My eyelids grew heavy, and the struggle to keep them open intensified. I resorted to splashing water on my face, which provided a momentary wake-up call. At that time of night, my truck was the lone vehicle on the road, and aside from the illumination from my headlights, darkness enveloped the surroundings. I can recall vividly the moment when I reached for my water bottle to take a sip and nearly choked when I spotted a dark figure ahead on the road, rapidly approaching. I slammed on the brakes, allowing the truck to come to a halt, affording me a better view of the person standing almost dead center on the road. The individual appeared to be attired in a black suit with a black scarf wound around their neck. What struck me as most peculiar was the person's remarkably elongated neck, to the point of appearing grotesque. It's an odd detail to note, but the elongated neck was truly striking. However, their face remained an indistinct blur, devoid of distinguishable features. As my truck slowed and drew near this enigmatic figure, I contemplated rolling down my window to offer assistance, but before I could, the person abruptly turned to their left and bolted toward the nearby forest. In that instant, I didn't dwell much on the bizarre occurrence. I simply accelerated and resumed my journey. Time was of the essence. After all, it was only about 20 seconds later that a creeping unease settled in, and my heart began to race as the true peculiarity of the situation dawned on me. Then, something else transpired. As I accelerated once more, a figure appeared ahead on the road, dashing along it. Initially, it resembled an animal, but as it drew nearer and vanished into the forest, I realized it bore a humanoid resemblance. This time, I didn't slam on the brakes. I simply maintained my high speed. I continued down the road, occasionally increasing my speed out of growing anxiety. Fatigue weighed heavily on me, and I occasionally drifted into the opposite lane without even realizing it. With about 40 minutes of driving remaining, I began searching for a suitable spot to pull over and rest. I eventually spotted a small entrance to a dirt area. I guided my truck onto this patch of dirt, engaged the parking brake, reclined my seat, and closed my eyes. Sleep, however, proved elusive, and I awoke suddenly amidst the enveloping darkness. Outside, through the windshield, an inexplicable instinct compelled me to turn on the headlights. As the beams of light pierced the blackness, they revealed a figure standing directly in front of the truck, a figure clad in a black scarf, the same individual I had encountered on the road earlier. Now, I could discern his face more distinctly. It featured an unnaturally wide grin in his eyes. He gazed directly at me through the windshield, prompting my heart to thunder in my chest. I hastily started the engine and sped away from that desolate dirt shoulder as fast as I could manage. My thoughts were a turbulent whirlwind. How could he have traversed a distance of 20 kilometers from where I first spotted him? I didn't stop again that night until I finally drifted off to sleep in a parking lot, awakening early the next morning. As I roused myself, my rational mind sought a plausible explanation, chalking up the previous night's bizarre occurrences to the fatigue-induced tricks my mind played on me. After all, I had encountered numerous strange phenomena that night, but never had I experienced hallucinations so vivid and terrifying. To this day, the memory of that night's haunting realism continues to linger, a mystery I may never fully unravel. I've been working as a truck driver since I turned 25, and over the course of my career, I've had my fair share of night drives that led to some strange encounters. I've worked for various companies, making deliveries that often required me to traverse the state, hauling wooden furniture along desert roads that stretched for hours. On this particular occasion, I was running late and knew most of my journey would be shrouded in darkness as I navigated the straight, desolate desert roads. This gave me the freedom to accelerate a bit, but I had to be vigilant, ready to slam the brakes if anything appeared on the road. As I drove, I came across a car parked in the desert sand beside the road. It was an older vehicle with its blinkers on. Curious, I pulled up behind it, thinking that someone might be in need of assistance. I approached the car and lightly tapped on the window, but there was no response. Leaning in closer, I checked all the windows, confirming that the car was empty. Despite the limited visibility in the cold, dark desert night, I felt a strong sense of empathy that evening and wanted to offer help. So, I returned to my truck, retrieved a flashlight from the toolbox beneath the passenger seat. This tactical flashlight emitted such a blindingly bright light that it could be painful if pointed directly at one's eyes. Previously, I may not have noticed, but the gas station's parking lot was covered in sand, blending seamlessly with the surrounding desert. The concrete floor of the station was hardly visible, and the adjacent abandoned building appeared to be an old convenience store, likely a relic from days gone by. In that moment, it made sense to me that the owner of the blinking car might be inside the station, so I approached the front door, which was completely shattered. With my flashlight illuminating a significant portion of the interior, I assumed it to be a typical convenience store found at most gas stations. It was no surprise that such a store couldn't thrive on a scarcely traveled road. I called out, inquiring if anyone was inside and announcing my willingness to help. The sound of my voice echoed eerily within the desolate building, sending shivers down my spine. Then, I heard a faint noise emanating from the other side of the store, seemingly the sound of shoes scraping against the concrete floor. The sound seemed to originate from shelves that likely once held drinks or snacks. I called out once more, offering assistance. I could distinctly discern what the whisperer had said, though I couldn't fathom why this person would utter those words. Additionally, I could hear heavy breathing emanating from one corner of the building, enough to send me rushing out of there and back to my truck. For a few bewildering moments, I was utterly disoriented, uncertain whether the sounds I had heard were real or figments of my imagination. I sprinted back to my truck and dialed the police out of sheer fright, too terrified to venture back inside. The police requested precise location details, but I couldn't provide an exact location, only that I was near a gas station, specifically an abandoned one in the middle of the desert. They instructed me to remain on the line, hoping for a better description of the location. Suddenly, the car parked in front of me roared to life and sped across the road. I was so disoriented that I hadn't even noticed when the person had entered the car. The darkness combined with the distraction of the phone call had thrown me off. I returned to the gas station, still on the line with the police, to investigate if anyone remained inside. I headed to the back of the store, where I had heard the voice and the breathing. What I encountered there left me paralyzed, a fresh pool of blood on the floor, leading me to imagine the grisly details of what had transpired. I informed the police over the phone that I may have witnessed a crime. Subsequently, the police dispatched multiple vehicles to the location. They asked for any potentially useful information, the car's license plate, the suspect's appearance, and the like. All I could provide was that the car was old and dark in color. I relayed that I had heard a male voice telling me to leave, followed by a woman's scream. As I departed, there was no trace of any bodies left behind. I had my theories about what might have unfolded, but I couldn't contribute significantly to the investigation. Unfortunately, I hadn't installed a dashboard camera on my truck at that time, which could have captured the license plate. However, within the next week, I made sure to acquire and install one. This incident was undoubtedly one of those rare experiences that occur once in a lifetime and will continue to haunt me for a long time to come. I'm 18 years old and I started working in a hotel a little over a month ago as a housekeeper. The hotel is located in the Midwest, in a rural area, not very busy except for family gatherings and a few travelers passing through the state. Many of the people who pass through are older, around 40 to 50 years old or more. When I started, my parents warned me to be careful because they thought the hotel was suspicious. I never thought it was suspicious, nor did the people who passed by, until one day about 2 weeks ago. I had just clocked in at around 10:30 and went to the end of the corridor, opposite the lobby, to start my work in the hotel area of the rooms, where people stayed for more than one night. At the end of the corridor, there were 4 rooms tucked away in a corner. You can't actually see the doors to these rooms until you get to the end of the corridor, 2 rooms on one side and 2 on the other. While I was getting all the supplies I needed to clean up, a man came out of one of the 4 rooms and asked how to use the coffee machine. He was about 3 times my size, at approximately 190 m and around 120 kilograms, while I'm only 150 m and around 50 kilograms. He didn't seem suspicious or strange, and as I'm very friendly and outgoing, I didn't mind making quick conversation. I went back to clean the other room and take care of my chores. When he came out again to tell me that his room didn't need cleaning, I was happy, as that meant one less room on my list. My manager had come out into the corridor to check on a room that guests had just left, and I had gone back into the corridor to help him clean another room. When the man came out of his room again, I thought he had another question about something in the room, so I turned to talk to him. That's when he asked, "Aren't you afraid to do your job?" I replied, "No, not really, since I rarely have any interaction with guests as a housekeeper." He then went on to say that I was very beautiful and that I needed a chain or a gun to protect me. I showed him my car keys, which I kept in my pocket as a security measure. The conversation didn't seem strange at first, but when I realized his true intentions, I became anxious and afraid. That's when he said, "I don't think the car keys are enough. You're small and could easily be carried." At that moment, I quickly went into the room where my manager was standing across the hall. I waited for him to return to his room before continuing my work. This experience really shook me. I spent about an hour crying and having anxiety attacks in another room in the corridor. I feared that this man would try to find me in whatever room I was working in and kidnap me. Fortunately, nothing happened, but I never want to see that man again. I don't even like to think about what would have happened if my manager hadn't been around. Before I start the story, I'd like to say that I'm from northern Norway and I'm also a woman. When I was younger, I used to do speed skating, which is a type of ice skating in which you try to become as fast as possible. I had 2 coaches, both very old. We took part in competitions in different places, where we competed against other people. I had been ice skating for about a year at the time, and we traveled a lot throughout the northern part of Norway. We had also traveled to Russia. On one occasion, we traveled to a small peninsula in the middle of nowhere. This small town had about 2,000 people and only one hotel. It took us about 5 hours by car to get there from my hometown. When we finally arrived, we settled into the hotel we had booked. For some reason, they had made 2 reservations, one room for my coaches and one just for me. At the time, everyone else who practiced ice skating with me had stopped or couldn't travel that far. At first, having a hotel room to myself seemed great, as I would have privacy and free time to do whatever I wanted while I was at the competitions, waiting for my turn to compete. I made friends with a girl called Marie, who made the weekend I was spending in that city a bit more fun. We were both the same age. We visited her school, where I extended an invitation to her. I thought it would be a good idea to bring her to the hotel and spend time together. Honestly, it was a great idea. We watched a movie, ate some snacks and had fun. At some point, it was time for her to leave, and it was very late, around midnight. When she left, I, being a very polite person, followed her into the lobby to say goodbye. I also intended to buy a bottle of soda while I was downstairs. When she left, I went to the counter near the exit to buy the soda. There was a man behind the counter who had an accent, so I guessed he had recently moved to Norway from another country. He seemed very interested in me and asked what I was doing in the lobby so late. I replied that I wanted to get a soft drink and asked for the price per bottle. He told me that a bottle cost around €5. I decided I wouldn't pay that much for a small bottle of soda, so I told him I'd go up to the room. The man immediately started begging me to stay downstairs and talk to him. This scared me a little, but I felt like I should stay. He asked a lot of questions, like what my name was, where I was from, if my parents were there, and who I was with. I answered all these questions, even though I felt threatened and insecure. I knew I shouldn't trust strangers, but I always tried to be friendly with everyone. Eventually, I told him that I was tired and would go upstairs to rest for a while. He tried to make me stay longer, but I decided to leave anyway. A few moments later, just as I was about to go to sleep, I heard someone knocking on my door. I thought it might be one of my trainers needing something, so I went to open the door. However, it wasn't any of them. It was the man from before. He was holding a lighter and, with a very strong accent, said he was looking for someone who had lost that lighter. I said it wasn't my lighter and was about to close the door when he put his foot between the door and the wall next to me and asked to come in. I was very scared and started pushing the door. I remember very little about that part, but I can tell you that I managed to close the door and lock it immediately. I called my mother, who in turn called my coaches to tell them about the incident. I never heard anything more about it after that night. When we got home, my mother called the hotel manager and complained about the incident. However, the manager said he wouldn't take any action against the man for what he had done, even though my mother continued to insist that his intentions were suspicious. I know it may sound ridiculous, but that man probably still works there today. I get confused remembering that incident, but I'm incredibly grateful that anything I did prevented him from coming in and doing something bad to me. It's something that still haunts me to this day. When I was 11, I was playing and riding my bike in the street with my friends. We did this every day. It was normal to be out playing at around 3 in the afternoon. On one such day, I was there with my sister and 4 other friends. We were all around 11 to 12 years old. Suddenly, a random man appeared and told us to go home in a rude way. We pretended not to hear, but he kept insisting that we should go home or we would regret it. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to what he was saying. He left, but about 10 minutes later, he appeared with another man, who looked much younger. As they walked in front of us, the rude man shot the younger one in the head, and, if that wasn't enough, he continued shooting several times, even after the man was already dead on the ground. After shooting the man, he pointed the gun in our direction, but everyone in the neighborhood came out of their houses because of the noise. He then ran off, but was arrested at the end of the day. As a child, I didn't give this event much thought, but now, as an adult, I realize how frightening that day was. That explains why I'm so afraid of blood and guns to this day. I'm not sure if the man really intended to kill us or if he was just trying to scare us, but the image of him coming at us and pointing the gun still haunts me. It's something that still haunts me to this day. When I was 12, I had a rich friend whose family owned a condominium in the mountains next to a famous ski resort. For her 13th birthday party, she invited me and a couple of other friends to stay at the condo and go snowboarding. After skiing on the slopes, we decided to explore the nearby village, which was extremely busy due to a festival that was taking place. When we thought it was time to go home, she mentioned that she knew a bus stop a little away from the village, which would probably be less crowded. so we went there to wait for the bus back to our condo. The bus stop was located at the end of the line, in a bus station that had a few benches outside, in front of a large glass wall, in a small arcade area with 3 or more games. We stayed inside, close to the games. Even though we didn't have any money to play, we kept checking the glass wall to see if the bus was coming. Eventually, we worried that we would miss it at the station, as there was no one else waiting there. So we decided to go to the benches outside. It was winter and starting to get dark earlier. One of the Shire girls was tense from the start. As the sun began to set, she was the only one to notice the presence of a balding white man, looking to be in his 50s or 60s, who was crouching behind the glass wall inside with his hands covering his face. Initially, we laughed at this for a minute and wondered what he was doing. Suddenly, he threw his hands up and made a sound, although it was muffled by the glass. This startled some of us, especially the nervous girl, who was already on the verge of tears. We saw the man continue to laugh before covering his face again. Still crouched behind us, we turned away again, whispering about how strange he was, but the nervous girl kept looking over her shoulder and warned us that he was doing it again. Some of us looked again, and he continued to hide his face and then throw his hands up in the air, smiling wide-eyed for a second before covering his face again. Instead of shouting like he did the first time, it looked like he was saying surprise before smiling and covering his face again. Startled, we all got up from our seats and went elsewhere. However, soon after, he opened the door and stuck his head out, shouting, "Surprise, I see you." He stood in the doorway waiting for a reaction, but we decided to ignore him. Eventually, he called out to us, asking if we wanted money to play the games. He pulled out his wallet and waved it around, but we continued to ignore him. He shouted again, "Don't you like games?" Our nervous friend pulled the birthday girl aside and said she thought she was going to pee her pants from fear. She asked us to leave. At this point, the man was sitting on the bench where we were, trying to look at us. I remembered seeing a restroom at the station and suggested we go there and call the birthday girl's mother to pick us up. There was a side door that led to the arcade area, and the toilets were on the other side of the corridor. We went around the side of the building and, on entering, ran to the ladies' room, huddling in the corner. While we were waiting at the station, the birthday girl's mother showed up to take us back to the condominium. There, we gave new statements and they showed us photos of possible suspects, which included a photo of the man we had seen. We found out that he had an assault record and had been on probation for less than a month. He was arrested after getting off a bus on the mountain, but we don't know if he was charged with anything. When I was younger, I lived in a rather peculiar neighborhood. There was a rehabilitation facility for people with mental problems. We were always warned not to interact with them and to take precautions. One day, I was riding my bike with a friend. I was in 5th grade, so I was about 12 years old. Finally, I managed to convince him to let me ride his bike, which was much better than mine, while he used mine for a while. I climbed to the top of a hill and saw some people in the street. I ignored them and waited for my friend to come up the hill on my bike. Then a man approached me and asked the time. I didn't answer, I just stayed silent. He came closer and closer, until he tried to grab my wrist and pull me off my bike. I started to scream and struggle, but the people in the street just laughed. When I got home, I told my grandmother what had happened, and she immediately called the police. A policeman came and asked me to accompany him to the place where it all happened, to try and identify the man. I pointed him out and it turned out that he had a history of assault and even murder. However, his records ended up being lost and he was sent to the rehabilitation facility for the mentally ill. Fortunately, he was taken back to prison that day. I want to share a scary story from my days working as a cashier in a local supermarket. I lived in a small town, and the store was only a 5 to 7 minute walk from my apartment. I was 18 at the time and trying to save money for college. However, I could never have imagined that this job in the store would bring me so much terror. The store was located in a part of town known for having alcoholics, addicts, and sinister people in general. It was a warm summer's evening, and as usual, I was working at the till. I used to get compliments from customers for being friendly and enjoying making conversation. I did notice a guy browsing the aisles of food and toiletries a few times, but I didn't pay much attention until something scary started to happen. My coworker took over the checkout, and I went to the toiletries stacking area. There, I got a better look at the guy, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a leather jacket on a sweltering summer evening. He didn't have a beard, but his eyes were so wide they gave me the shivers. I tried not to pay attention to him, but he kept walking and looking straight at me. If I turned the other way, he took a few steps away and continued to stare at me. My shift was coming to an end, so I expected him to leave soon, but he didn't leave. He even followed me towards the staff room. I went to the security guard and asked him to ask the guy to leave or buy something. I'm not sure what happened next, as I quickly gathered my things and rushed out. That decision proved to be a mistake. I should have gone straight home, but I assumed that since the security guard had spoken to him, he wouldn't do anything more to me. I remember putting my headphones and phone in my bag. I realized I had forgotten my hat in the staff room and was about to go back to get it when I saw him again. He was about 5 meters away from me, standing calmly, just looking around. I started walking quickly and passed the gas station, but he was still following me. He continued following me along a path towards my apartment. At that moment, my heart was beating fast, and I thought, he's going to do something now. I looked back, and he was still behind me, staring with that predatory look. Fortunately, my brother appeared out of nowhere and the guy quickly turned and walked away. I was so scared that I stayed inside my apartment for 3 days before forcing myself to go back to work. Even so, I always checked my surroundings, and I'm eternally grateful to my brother for appearing at that moment. It happened about a year ago, and there were so many terrible factors working against me that night that I'm surprised I came out unscathed, at least physically. It all started when I was in the apartment of a friend who lives in a questionable part of town. That night, I made some bad decisions, deciding to get drunk and take some pills. I had no idea what they were. It's safe to say that, after a night of intense partying, at around 4 a.m. I wasn't in a very good state of mind. My drug-addled brain decided that instead of spending the night at my friend's apartment, as I normally would, I wanted to go back to my own apartment. My friend's apartment had 2 separate entrances to the building, one at the back, unlit from the parking lot, and one facing the street. They had 2 sets of keys for each door, and I only had the keys to the back entrance of the apartment. Since my Uber would obviously arrive on the street, and the front door of the building would automatically lock behind you, leaving through the back entrance was the only option. As the driver was about to arrive, I looked back, standing outside that apartment, and realized that I looked like the easiest target on the planet. I'm a young woman in my 20s. I could barely stand up drunk, and I was using a street pole for support, and I wasn't even doing a very good job of it. The street light was like a beacon to any predators in the vicinity, saying, "Come and get me." I wasn't paying attention to my surroundings, despite the fact that there was literally a bullet hole in the front door I'd just come out of. It wasn't a good situation. I remember checking which car I was going to be picked up in, and all I saw was that it was a black sedan. Shortly after leaving the building, a black sedan pulled up to the curb and started to lower its window. At that moment, I took a step forward, without letting the man speak, because I sensed that something was wrong. He had an expression that seemed to be tearing me apart with his eyes. After seeing that look, I gave new meaning to the word predator to describe a criminal, because now I knew what it was like to be prey. This man basically shouted at me, claiming to be my Uber driver. That was the second red light that somehow managed to penetrate my mind. Normally, Uber drivers just roll down the window and ask for your name. I think I stared at him for a second, while my brain tried to make sense of the situation I was potentially in. I asked him what my name was, and he immediately got angry, shouting that he didn't have time for that and that I should get in the car. I don't think I've ever sobered up so quickly in my life. I was completely panicked. Obviously, this wasn't my Uber. Quickly checking the license plate, I immediately realized that it didn't match. Meanwhile, this guy was still shouting at me, and I had absolutely no idea what to do. If I ran off in any direction, this guy could easily catch up with me or even be armed. I was convinced that if he was trying to pick up a random girl off the street, he probably had a gun. I couldn't run back to the apartment door, as it locked automatically behind you, and I didn't have the keys or the time to use them. Running towards the back door wouldn't help either, as he had his car facing the back parking lot, and I would again have to take the time to find the right keys and get in. If I shouted, I wasn't exactly in a neighborhood where anyone would try to be a hero, and I could still hear the music from my friend's third-floor apartment, so I knew they wouldn't hear me. Besides, it was 4 in the morning, and absolutely no one was around. People often say that, at times like this, they either spring into action immediately due to adrenaline or freeze, but I felt incapable of doing either. It was the worst feeling I've ever experienced in my life. Everything in me told me to run, but I felt that if I did that, it would be the end of me. However, if I continued to stand still, staring in shock at this man who was shouting at me, the result would be the same. From the moment he started shouting at me until now, I think only 20 seconds have passed. He seemed to be getting ready to get out of the car when suddenly another black sedan pulled up right behind him. Checking the license plate as quickly as I could, I realized it was my real Uber and rushed into the car, shouting to my real Uber driver, "What's my name?" The poor man was clearly terrified, but responded with my name quickly, to which I said, "Get me out of here. That man is trying to kidnap me." If I had been in the position of an Uber driver, I think I would have been too shocked to react as quickly as he did, but he sped away from there, offered to call the police for me, which I refused, although I now regret it, and then took me to the front door of my apartment, making sure I got in safely. He really was an incredible human being, and I can say that he received the fattest tip my university student bank account would allow, although he deserved much, much more. It happened a few months ago. At the beginning of March, I was with some friends in a bar in West Hollywood, a place we frequented often. It was just after the bar closed, around 1:30 in the morning, and we were walking back to the car. My friends saw one of the free disease testing tents and decided to get tested. I told them to go ahead and I would wait for them. Normally, I wouldn't do this anywhere else, but I knew the area well and felt safe. In that area, there are several options open until 4 a.m. at weekends, and it's not uncommon for the streets to still be busy until 2 or 3 in the morning. As a woman, I felt safe being left alone, as I wasn't so worried about meeting scary men in the area. After waiting for a while, I heard my name being called. I turned around and saw another friend of mine. I ran up to him and we chatted for a while. He told me where he was going and told me to meet him there if we were still around. This only increased my sense of security, but nothing could prepare me for what would happen next. We said goodbye, and I went back to lean on a newsstand around the corner. I'd been wearing heels all night and my feet were starting to hurt, so I thought it would be a relief. While I was there, I watched the cars go by as I waited for the traffic light. Just then a beautiful new gray car pulled up and lowered its window. The driver called out, "Miss?" I pointed to myself, wondering if he was talking to me or not. He confirmed that he was. I went to the car, thinking that maybe he needed directions or something. Just then, I noticed that he had an Uber sticker on the windshield. Now it made sense. He was looking for the person who had asked for a ride. However, I hadn't asked for an Uber. He smiled and said, "I know." At this point, I started to feel a little uncomfortable. but I still thought that maybe he really did need directions. He said that he had been watching me, which made me wonder if he was just passing by and saw me standing there. He continued, "My girlfriend is looking for someone like you." I noticed that he said he was watching me, not that he just saw me standing there too. I asked him what he meant by someone like me. He then mentioned that his girlfriend was looking for someone with my profile and told me that I had a perfect figure. Just then, the traffic light turned green, and he asked me to move out of the way so he could move the car and not get in the way of traffic. This was a perfect opportunity to get out of there. If the alcohol hadn't been affecting my judgment, I would have taken this chance to leave immediately. However, when he stopped the car at the curb, I went over and continued the conversation. He asked if I was working and what I did for a living. He then mentioned that this could be a great opportunity to earn more money. I politely declined, saying I wasn't interested. He then suggested that I give him my number and his girlfriend would contact me in the next few days so that I could think about the offer. I took his phone and entered a number from a messaging app that I use specifically for situations like this. As I handed the phone back, he held my wrist and commented on my tattoo. Then he asked if I was there alone, running his thumb over my wrist. That was the limit for me, and I wanted to leave immediately. I told him that my friends were nearby, about to leave at any moment, and I needed to get back to them. He finally let go of my wrist and took out a large sum of money, tied up with rubber bands. It must have been at least 3 or 4 inches thick. He waved the money and said, "Think about this offer, darling." Then he sped off and drove away. I never saw him again, and we didn't want to meet again. This happened in November last year. A close friend and I were on break from college and decided to go to a concert in downtown Chicago. Since we grew up in the suburbs, it was common for us to have fun in the city. We had a great time at the show and decided to call an Uber to get home, since we weren't near the train station. My friend informed me that the Uber app wasn't working for him at the time, so I decided to call Uber. However, it was literally my first time using the service, and I ended up calling an Uber pool without knowing what it was. We soon discovered that it meant sharing the ride with other people. My friend realized this, but he said, "It doesn't matter." The driver picked us up outside the concert venue, where there were a lot of intoxicated people, as you'd expect after a concert. However, we were sober, as we had only drunk 1 or 2 cans each. We got into the car and everything seemed normal. However, we didn't notice the direction the driver was taking, as we were engaged in a conversation about the concert. Eventually, we realized that the driver was taking us to the south of Chicago, which didn't make sense since our suburbs were in the opposite direction. Initially, we decided not to worry too much about it, attributing the detour to the fact that we were new to Uber pool. However, we started to get worried when we realized that the driver wasn't answering our questions about the destination of the trip. That's when we picked up another passenger. To be honest, this girl scared us. We don't like to judge people, but her appearance and the way she spoke made us uneasy. As soon as the girl got into the car, we asked the driver where we were going first. However, he stopped answering. What worried us even more was when my phone lit up and showed that the Uber ride had been canceled for the duration of the trip, and Uber had no record of my presence in the car. I asked the driver what was going on, but he didn't answer. The girl and the driver clearly knew each other, as they used nicknames when calling each other. The girl looked strange and was making some hand gestures to the driver. At that moment, we started driving into an extremely suspicious neighborhood, the scariest we've ever seen. We had no idea that neighborhoods like that existed. All the houses were in terrible condition. There were no street signs on most of the streets. Most of the street lights were out or flickering, and homeless people were lying on the sidewalks. There were destroyed and dirty warehouses everywhere. It was by far the scariest area we had ever seen. Nobody seemed to care or would hear us scream in that area. When we started to see all this, we became even more frightened, especially as the driver still wouldn't answer our questions. My friend then said to me, "We need to get out of here," I replied. "Look where we are." However, we were taken down an alley behind a warehouse. The driver was driving at an extremely slow speed, around 15 kilometers per hour, but the girl continued to communicate with him discreetly using hand signals. At that moment, our hearts sank even further, and we thought we would be killed in that alley, or at best, someone would get into the car and rob us. Then the driver stopped the car, unlocked the doors, and I was in complete shock. With a pale face, that's when my friend said, "Hey, I'm completely sober, and I'm about to call the police." He had the police number already dialed on his phone. The Uber driver looked at us shocked when he saw my friend's finger about to make the call. He looked at the girl, who was also in shock, and she nodded negatively before getting out of the car. The driver then pulled out of the alley and took us back on the road towards our suburb. My Uber app finally sent a notification informing me that we were now on a ride. The driver started talking to us again, but he didn't give any answers about what had just happened. He just told us where we were going, but didn't explain anything about what had happened. Finally, we got home safely. We reported the Uber driver for this trip, as it was clearly suspicious. We believed that the driver was waiting in the vicinity of the concert to pick up people who were too drunk to realize what was going on. However, he realized it was too big a risk when they decided to take action. We were part of a robbery scheme, and we were lucky not to be drunk at the gig. We were anxious for weeks after this incident, but we learned to be more cautious and safe in Chicago and not to call a shared Uber outside a concert. I've generally had positive experiences with Uber drivers, but what happened yesterday left me deeply frightened. I'm 23 and female. Yesterday, I had a night shift at my company, where I work at TFL. At around 8 p.m., I decided to order something to eat via Uber. From the start, I had a strange feeling of anxiety. The driver seemed very peculiar. He was extremely tall, quite overweight, and wore a hood on his head at all times. When he arrived at my workplace to deliver the food, I left the building to pick it up. To be honest, the guy looked scary. He looked at me, and I said hello when he asked if it was my order. I said yes, expecting him to simply hand me my food. However, he looked at me strangely and asked again if it was my order. It's important to note that he spoke my native language, so I didn't understand why he hadn't understood my initial response. He kept staring at me and finally handed me my order. He asked if I worked there, and I said yes, trying to end the conversation as quickly as possible. I walked to the stairs and felt that he was still watching me. When I looked back, I saw that he was standing there, just looking in my direction. I walked through the door, and instead of going to my office, I headed for the elevator. I was completely alone on this floor, as most companies close for the day. While I was in the elevator, I looked out of the window and saw that he was still outside. He seemed to be following me for no apparent reason, as he only had one order in his bag, which he had already handed to me. I didn't reduce his tip, but I confess I was scared all night. I work as a paramedic, and this story took place during a summer evening while we were responding to a call in a rural area. My partner and I were driving along a winding two-lane road in the middle of nowhere, with no light in sight apart from our vehicle's headlights and the light of the moon. We were approaching a right-hand bend when I spotted a man walking across the grass, coming out of an area of scrubland. He was moving strangely, quickly and smoothly, as if he were pedaling a bicycle, but without the characteristic up and down movement of the pedals, as if he were running. I confess that I was very confused to see someone on a bicycle in the middle of the night in a rural area, but I wasn't entirely surprised. However, my surprise increased when this man came to a tree and stopped abruptly. It was at that moment that we passed him in our truck. I looked out of the window and saw the man standing next to the tree, but there was no bicycle in sight. He was dressed in white, like the moon, and seemed to be floating there, watching the truck as we passed. A shiver ran down my spine at that moment. We continued towards the call, and I couldn't help asking my partner if he had also seen that strange figure. His response was, "Man, I thought I was going crazy." I lived on a large cattle farm in the Australian outback until I was 16. A few years before we moved, my father and I were searching for some lost cattle in the fields that stretched up into the steep, rocky mountains of the region. As we crossed a shallow stream, our horses began to show signs of restlessness. It seemed that they were sensing something in the air and getting nervous. Above us, in the treetops, we noticed strange movements. My horse began to back away, and my father reached out to grab the reins, trying to calm the animal down. It was at that moment that something big and surprising happened. Our horses shot off in opposite directions, and I had to use all my strength to control my horse's reins. My father finally approached me, visibly anxious for us to get away from there. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that he had seen a kangaroo. However, this kangaroo was dead and hanging from a tree. He explained that the smell of the kangaroo already gave it away as prey, and this smell had made our horses agitated. My father cast a worried glance over his shoulder and encouraged us to move more quickly. I remember him muttering to himself, "How the hell did he get up that damn tree?" Ever since that day, the story about big cats in the Australian bush was the only explanation we could think of for a dead kangaroo hanging from the top of a tree. I was 14 at the time and was taking part in an expedition with the Boy Scouts. We were canoeing down the Buffalo River, in Arkansas, on a trip that would last 6 days. We were a small group, made up of about 10 boys and 3 adults, and for most of the journey, we hadn't spotted anyone outside our group. One night, a friend and I decided that we weren't going to sleep in the tents as usual. Instead, we wanted to spend the night in hammocks by the river. However, I woke up in the middle of the night being attacked by hungry mosquitoes and realized that this had not been a good idea. I decided to return to my tent, where my colleague was already sleeping without me. The camp we had chosen to spend the night in was quite spacious, and the tents were distributed some distance apart. As I walked towards my tent, I passed one of them and noticed a strange shape next to it. At first, I thought it was just the boy's messy backpack, but its shape was strange and it didn't look like an ordinary backpack. It was too dark to see clearly, but something made me kick the object. To my surprise, it emitted a sound of pain when I kicked it. I was startled, as we were in a secluded spot, and my first assumption was that someone who was supposed to be in that tent was outside for some reason. I knelt down next to the object and asked, "What are you doing here?" The answer I received left me terrified. The man replied, "I like you." My heart felt like it was going to explode with fear. He was a complete stranger, and that wasn't the answer I expected. I realized that he had a knife attached to his waist and, irrationally, I thought I had to take the knife away from him. Instead of running away or calling for help, I tried to get the knife, but he held my arm firmly and ordered, "You need to go back to bed." Not knowing what to do, I just agreed and walked away from him. I walked the last few meters to my tent, where my tent mate was about to have a nervous breakdown. I told him what had happened, but he didn't believe me, thinking I was making it all up. The next morning, the adults in the group called me in to talk. When I left the tent, I realized that people's belongings were scattered everywhere. I discovered that someone, probably the same man, had searched all the tents for valuables. One of the adults noticed that his expensive camera was missing. They decided to look for signs of someone else in the area, but found no one. To this day, this is the scariest incident of my life. Even now, at the age of 36, my wife laughs at me because I still sleep with a nightlight. I don't know why, but I've been thinking about this event all day. This happened in April 2016, after I had spent 9 days hiking in the mountains. the experience on the trail was transformative for me, and I developed an irresistible desire to go camping all year round, taking advantage of every opportunity that arose. The farm where I grew up sits on a hill overlooking an area where tobacco and soy are grown. It's an enchanting landscape, and the stream that meanders through the area sometimes looks more like a small river. In this place, it is common to find indigenous arrowheads, which has always aroused my curiosity. Feeling nostalgic, I decided to camp near the stream, at the end of an old road. This was an activity we used to do when we were younger, and the area was as familiar to me as the back of my hand. In the past, there had been an old barn, but it had already been demolished. I chose to set up my camp on the opposite side of the road, on the banks of the stream, without venturing as far as we used to when we were younger. I lit a small fire, settled into my hammock and enjoyed a snack I had brought with me. However, despite the familiar surroundings, something was out of place. I was trying to relax, but a restlessness came over me. It's important to note that this place was practically part of my backyard, located about 400 meters from my front door. That night, however, I felt extremely uncomfortable. This was strange, considering that I had spent 9 days on the Appalachian Trail without feeling anything like that. The night was still and quiet when suddenly a strong gust of wind swept through the camp out of nowhere. This made no sense, as I was surrounded by trees and protected by a hill. The topography of the site made this gust inexplicable. At that moment, a feeling of foreboding began to envelop me, as if I wasn't alone and was being watched. While I was trying to understand what was going on, I suddenly heard some deep, rumbling noises that seemed to come from all sides. No more than 5 meters away, there were no footsteps, no whispers, just those snores. I thought it might be a moose, but why hadn't I heard any movement? At that moment, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I decided it was time to get out of there. I quickly dismantled the camp and put out the fire. I hurried up the hill, as the feeling of unease persisted. As I dismantled the camp, something inside me was stirring, and I felt that I needed to get out of that place immediately. It was an intense feeling, which only dissipated when I was at least 15 meters from where I had camped. I'm not sure what it was, but I was relieved that I hadn't found out. It may have just been my mind playing tricks on me, but after all these years I've learned to trust my instincts in situations like this. I live in a small town in upstate New York, and as someone who lives in an urban area, I never thought I'd experience something like this. Sure, strange people have always been considered a potential threat, but animals, let alone strange creatures, have never been on my radar. However, an experience I had a few months ago changed my mind forever. At the time, I was working a night shift in a warehouse. My working hours went from 5 p.m. to 4:30 a.m., which practically turned me into a night person. On my days off, I didn't bother trying to keep a normal sleep schedule. I stayed up all hours of the night while my husband slept. It was on one of these nights, at around 5 a.m., that I decided to go out for a smoke in the backyard. It was Halloween, a nice evening. My yard was typical of an urban area, with a small fenced yard on one side and a retaining wall at the back of the house. This was common in the city, as much of it was built on the slopes of a hill. There was also a huge dead and completely rotten tree that had fallen in our yard the previous spring and which the owner had not yet removed. It was about 3 meters in diameter, but its wood was so decayed that it crumbled in your hands. It had fallen in such a way that one end was about 1.5 meters from my back door, and the other was resting on the retaining wall, creating a sort of ramp. I knew something was living inside this hollow space, and I assumed it was a raccoon, since I used to hear scratching noises coming from there. However, this never seemed strange or scary to me, as I love animals, and the idea of having wildlife in my backyard was something I considered an honor. However, that night, something seemed different. As I opened the door to leave, I felt an unusual discomfort, which was rare for me. I spent many hours outside at night, especially on nice evenings. Sitting for hours, smoking and watching the handful of stars I could see through the city's light pollution. That night, however, something was out of place. It was darker than usual, and the silence was strangely oppressive. I had a distinct feeling that I was being watched. I stood in the doorway for a few moments, because I'm someone who follows instincts. My instinct was telling me to go back into the house, but my curiosity was leading me to investigate. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized that something wasn't right. I saw the silhouette of an animal, but it was too big to be any city animal I knew. Maybe it was a big dog. As I looked more closely, I became certain that it was a living creature. This allowed me to take a closer look. This is where the situation starts to get confusing, and I can understand if it sounds crazy. The silhouette resembled a curved, vaguely human being, covered in skin, at least from what I could discern in the dim light. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight, still uncertain whether what I was seeing was real or just an illusion. However, as soon as I switched on the flashlight, the creature emitted a horrible scream and started moving towards me, down the trunk ramp with grotesque and unnatural movements. At that moment, I panicked. I quickly retreated into the house, locking the door in a single movement as my heart pounded uncontrollably. I stood there, watching the door for an hour, although it seemed much longer. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold, a slow tapping on the window. I couldn't move, and my mind seemed unable to process what was happening. Suddenly, the door handle began to turn slowly, then jiggled, as if the creature outside was frustrated to find the door locked. Slowly, I moved away from the door, closing the office door behind me, aware that whatever it was could easily break the window if it really wanted to get in. I stood outside the room, listening for any sound coming from there. Just when I thought the threat had passed, I heard a loud bang coming from the next room, as if something had hit the air conditioning unit hanging in the window. At that moment, I called the police and reported that I was concerned about the presence of a rabid animal outside my building. I vaguely explained what had happened, afraid that they would think it was a prank and not send help. I also woke up my husband while they were on their way. When the police arrived, I explained again what had happened. 2 of them entered my apartment, while another 2 circled the building, all with their weapons ready. However, whatever it was had disappeared. They searched everywhere, even waking my neighbors to check their yards, explaining that they believed there was a rabid animal loose. However, they found nothing. The police left and, as you can imagine, I couldn't sleep until the sun came up. Since then, I haven't had any more strange experiences, but I have stopped going out at night. My former curiosity about the wildlife in my backyard turned into a deep unease. With Halloween approaching, I thought I'd share this story that happened in 2012 in the town of Word, Colorado. Word is an old silver mining town, named after Calvin Word, who disappeared there in 1860. This town has a particularly creepy past, with sinister stories of mine owners killing all their workers in the middle of the night just to avoid paying wages. Later, many Vietnam War veterans and gang members settled in Word, since local law enforcement was almost non-existent. As a result, the town's reputation as a dangerous place only grew from there. There was an old hotel in town that had been converted into apartments, and that night, some of our friends were holding a Halloween party there. Most of the people had their faces painted and wore creative costumes, such as pirates and lumberjacks, among others. As we talked to some of the occupants, they shared some spooky stories about the place being haunted. These stories included doors slamming on their own upstairs and locking people in, as well as footsteps being heard when no one was home. As the night progressed and people consumed various magic potions and elixirs, which were actually shots of alcohol, things got livelier. Some of our friends were wrestling, while others were playing a game known as Jack Jumped Over the Candle, where people jumped over a candle that was placed higher and higher with each round. I was in charge of driving, so our group decided to leave and head home. However, one of my good friends opted to stay and continue the party. This is where the story gets intriguing, and I'm going to switch to his perspective for the rest of the narrative. After you left, they told me to go into the main room, which had a large stone fireplace. It was dark, and I sat in the shadows while we started talking. At that moment, this person started telling me that he was an angel of light and that he had created the world. My head was spinning, but I was mesmerized by the narrative, because the examples and the way he spoke were very persuasive. I began to believe that I was having a divine encounter. Then, suddenly, a small sphere of light passed over this person's face, illuminating an extremely disfigured face. Startled, I backed away, and he began to grunt. As I stumbled back into the living room, I turned around and saw everyone staring at me from across the room in silence. No one said a word, and I mumbled an excuse to leave, saying I needed to give my dog some water. I ran out into the night and, to my horror, saw what looked like an angel with its wings cut off, with 2 bloody stumps on its back. He was urinating into an empty champagne bottle. Frightened, I ran to my car and was surprised by a gust of wind. I looked up and saw something flying above me, but I couldn't make out any details in the darkness. I drove back to my house in a panic and locked the door, afraid that someone or something might follow me home. I don't know what was in word, but I'm sure I don't intend to go back there for Halloween anytime soon. It happened when I was in high school. Back then, I worked part-time in a grocery store, and it became a tradition for a group of us to visit some spooky attraction for Halloween. The first year, we went to a haunted forest, then to a corn maze that started with me falling into a mud puddle. It also included situations like being trapped in a shed with horror movie characters chasing us, including Leatherface from the Chainsaw Massacre, among others. It was fun, and this was our 3rd year doing it. We were all going to a haunted factory in a nearby town. As it was before the age of smartphones, we relied on printed directions or maps. Due to the size of our group, we had to travel in 3 cars. I was in the last car of the caravan, with my friends Noelle and Jane. Unfortunately, we got lost because the people at the front of the group were terrible at navigation, and we ended up in a tricky part of town. At one point, we passed a parking lot and heard someone shouting. Eventually, our car got separated from the rest of the group at a traffic light, and when it turned green again, we lost everyone else. We drove around for a while, talking to other people on the phone, trying to find each other. I was in the back seat, trying to give instructions to my driver, Noelle, while Laura was trying to do the same with her husband, who was driving another car. It wasn't going well. Eventually, I said something like, "Noelle, just stop somewhere and let them find us." There were plenty of places we could have stopped, like a Burger King or an office parking lot, but he chose a dark bar parking lot. Perhaps it was because there was a large bank sign nearby, which served as a good reference point for the others to find us. So we were waiting in this parking lot for the others when a line of about 7 cars arrived at the bar. This wasn't so surprising, since it was a Friday night, but they didn't park normally. Instead, they surrounded our car, pointing in our direction, and because of their proximity, there was no room for us to get out. For a few minutes, they just stared at us from inside their cars, and then they all got out and started approaching us. There were at least 10 intimidating-looking guys, and at this point, I was convinced that we were about to be robbed. "Put your wallet away," I said to Noelle and Jane, and I did the same. I didn't have much money anyway, which worried me because I wondered what they would do if they didn't find anything of value. I was terrified, but I tried to stay calm. Noelle didn't seem too worried, which surprised me, since his car had not only a teenager, me, and his girlfriend, Jane, but also Jane, who was so scared that she was crying. The guy I assumed was the leader came to the passenger door, approaching Jane and me, who were sitting in the back seat. He looked inside the car at us for a moment, and then he and his group went back to their cars and parked normally. Well, I wasn't willing to risk anything and asked Noelle, rather insistently, to go to Burger King, for God's sake. Eventually, we managed to get together with the others and arrived at the haunted factory. To my surprise, the attraction was much less scary than what we had endured in the parking lot. I have a few theories about the incident. Perhaps the guys got to the car and realized that we probably didn't have much to offer them, so they changed their minds about mugging us. However, that seems unlikely. Another possibility is that they thought we were other people until they got to the car and looked inside, which is definitely possible. A third theory is that they were just toying with us. Whatever the reason, I was really scared, and to this day, 13 years later, I walk in that city with caution. This happened when I was around 10 or 11 years old. It was Halloween night, and to make things even more exciting, this year it fell on a Friday. I was doing the traditional trick-or-treat with a friend of mine, whom I'll call Jane. Our mothers were with us. Jane was dressed as a birthday present, and I was dressed as the Scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz. It was around 9 p.m. and we had collected a veritable mountain of sweets. Our arms were starting to ache from carrying the full bags. During our walk, we came to a hill in our neighborhood. There were no houses until we reached the top, and I was determined to increase my amount of sweets as quickly as possible. So I ran to the top of the hill, leaving Jane and our mothers behind. When I reached the top, I heard my mother shouting for me to wait for them. I was impatient, but I still obeyed. Just then, a black car pulled up next to me. I can't remember what kind of car it was, but I think it was a Honda Civic or something similar. The driver, a man who looked between 20 and 30 years old, rolled down his window and greeted me with a hello. He seemed friendly, so I replied cheerfully with a hello back. Then he asked, "Did you get a lot of sweets tonight?" I replied with a yes and showed him my almost overflowing bag of sweets. He smiled and said, "That's amazing. Could you come over here and give me some sweets?" It was at that moment that I froze. My parents had always warned me not to talk to strangers, and although the guy didn't look like a criminal, all the signs were there. Even at the age of 10 or 11, I could see that. I really didn't know what to do at that moment. I think the guy noticed my face because he insisted, "I just want some candy. You don't have to give me your whole bag." I noticed that someone in the passenger seat of the car leaned over to look at me, and they both had scary smiles on their faces. At that moment, I was in doubt as to whether I should run or not. Fortunately, my mother came running up the hill. Having seen what was happening, the guy noticed too, and his face turned white. He said, "I have to go," as he looked at my mother and sped off down the road. My mother ran to me, and I threw my arms around her, starting to cry. When Jane and her mother finally caught up with us, we all went back to my house. I was clinging to my mother's arm the whole time, and my bag of sweets managed to distract me from the situation. However, every now and then, I look back and can't help but wonder what might have happened if I'd gone to that guy's car. I thank God I was smart enough not to.